As Iran celebrates its 1979 revolution, the supreme leader is urging people to come out in great numbers in defiance of the US. President Donald Trump has promised to get tough with Iran. But how far will his threats go? And how will Iran respond? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Tens of thousands of Iranians have been on the streets of Tehran. They're marking the 38th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, but it's also being seen as a show of defiance towards the United States. Iran's supreme leader has called on people to come out in great numbers to stand up to the US. President Donald Trump has threatened to get tough on Iran, telling the country recently it's been put on notice. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani spoke at a rally on Friday and had this to say.
In America, some newbies have taken power. All of them must know that they should talk to the Iranian people with the language of respect. This nation will give a decisive answer to threats.
And President Trump, too, has threatened to be decisive with Iran. So how far could the escalation go? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first our State Department correspondent Patty Culhane has the latest from Washington, D.C.
The Trump administration has not minced words on Iran.
As of today, we are officially putting Iran on notice.
Some see that as the administration drawing a red line. If so, Iranian leaders are making clear they don't think it's a line the U.S. will actually cross.
They would not dare carry out military threats against Iran. The Americans know very well that Iran and its allies in the region would retaliate very hard and make America face dark days to come.
Advisor to the Supreme Leader, Ali Akbar Velati, told Al Jazeera in an exclusive interview that Iran will continue to develop its missile program, describing it as defensive. Advocate Trita Parsi, who works for better U.S.-Iranian relations, says that response should have been expected.
They immediately put on the toughest possible position because their belief is that the only thing that would deter an attack is if they come across as strong. If the United States believes that Iran is being intimidated, they believe that will invite further threats and potentially even action by the United States. Whether that's true or not, we can debate.
The U.S. president has surrounded himself with advisors who see Iran as a big threat. Steve Bannon, who has said the West is engaged in a clash of civilizations with Islam and its followers, and National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. He was criticized for his past intelligence work for trying to link Iran to most attacks. That's according to people who worked with him, like Joshua Manning.
To call them, the root of all evil, and to call them, the force behind every terrorist incident in the United States or across the world, which is probably what is being put into the president's ear right now, is not true, and it's going to cause a war.
Still, President Trump is leading a U.S. public wary of war, elected on a promise to keep the U.S. out of military conflicts overseas. At the same time, he promised to take a tougher stand on Iran. The open question, with potentially deadly consequences, can he do both? Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Now, the escalating tensions could end up affecting the Iran nuclear deal, an agreement President Donald Trump has repeatedly criticised. It was signed in July 2015 after years of negotiations. And if Trump wants to scrap the deal, he'll have to get the other signatories on board. That's France, Germany, the UK, China, Russia and the EU. The deal requires Iran to be more transparent about its nuclear program and gives the international community a say in how that program is developed. But some don't like the fact that the deal allows Iran to continue enriching uranium, even if it can only do so at very low levels. And there are concerns that when the agreement expires in 15 years, Iran may have the capacity to build a nuclear bomb. Well, let's get the thoughts of our guests now. Joining me on this edition of Inside Story in Tehran, we have Mostafa, a political analyst in Washington, D.C., Kenneth Katzman. He's an Iran expert with the Congressional Research Service. And in London, Ellie Geranmayeh, a policy fellow for the Middle East and North Africa programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to all of my guests on this edition of Inside Story. Mustafa, can I come to you first in Tehran? Is this Iranian sabre rattling, or is Iran weighing up how the American administration is going to deal with it?
Well, as a matter of fact, the Iranians are entertained by Mr. Trump's hawkish policies and decisions that he declares these days. As a matter of fact, Iranians believe that Mr. Trump's administration and the United States under Trump is even weaker than Mr. Obama's America when he was in charge, because Trump has so many difficulties with the public opinion back at home and abroad. He's got so many difficult problems with the economy. He has already initiated some kind of war, economic war, against China. He is in deep trouble with some parts of Europe, and he's got widening differences with the Europeans. He's got a problem with Mexicans, and also a simple phone talk with
Mustafa,
Australian officials.
I'm not trying to interrupt too much.
So he's in trouble.
Mustafa, I'm not trying to interrupt too much. We know that we can get the histrionics, you might say, of how the Americans perceive Mr. Trump. Is how Iran is actually perceiving Mr. Trump right now. You said at the moment you felt that they're in a weak position, or they think he's in a weak position. At this present moment in time, do you think they want to deal with a Trump administration? They can deal with a Trump administration, or they even want to deal with a Trump administration?
Well, what I'm trying to tell you is that Iranians believe that Trump is just bluffing. Therefore, they are not taking him too much seriously, but that does not mean that they are not working for a response. As a matter of fact, Trump's hawkish policies are going to backfire. You know, this is an election year in Iran. In a few months, we will have presidential elections. And a number of factors, including Mr. Trump's policies, are believed to backfire, because he is reinvigorating the principalists' camps, the critics of President Rouhani in Tehran, and the IRGC and others, who believe that the United States can be treated only through force and not through diplomacy and negotiation. Another factor is defiance of the United States under the nuclear deal. Iran has fully complied with its undertakings under the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. But the United States, even under President Obama, they defied. At least that's what officials and people in Tehran believe. That,
we'll come to the details.
The United States under Obama even defied undertakings.
Mustafa, we'll come to the deal in a moment and flesh that out for our viewers. Let me go over to Kenneth Katzman. You heard what Mostafa Khoshchesm had to say in Tehran and the perception of the Trump administration at this moment in time. Is the US saber rattling? Are they just weighing up, you might say, their enemy?
Let me just clarify, I'm speaking in a personal capacity as an Iran expert, not in speaking for the U.S. government or the Congress or anybody, of course. So I think, you know, what I say is, we've turned the clock back to really when President George W. Bush declared Iran as part of the axis of evil. In other words, Iran is again defined as not a potential partner against the Islamic State, not a normal interlocutor, but more of an adversary, more of a strategic threat. This is how the new administration is characterizing Iran. The view that the nuclear deal was flawed. It was only for a limited duration, and it didn't dismantle all the facilities. So there's a skepticism, although to contrast with the guest in Tehran, there was some concern that the Trump administration might cancel the nuclear deal or pull out of it. And I think we're now seeing a clarification of what the administration policy is, and it looks like the administration wants to preserve the JCPOA, the Joint Plan of Comprehensive Plan of Action. Let me counter Iran in the region.
Yeah, let me go over to Ellie then, Geranmayeh in London. Europe perhaps has a very different perspective on the current situation. We've are now seeing the EU foreign minister head to Washington, D.C. to talk to her equivalent, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. What is that telling us? Because at the moment there's been no joint statement about the conclusion of their talk. So Iran must have been top of the agenda there.
Well, indeed, we know from a statement from the EU High Representative that Iran has featured pretty high on the list of issues to be discussed with counterparts in the US. Look, the European countries, 3 of them, which signed up to this deal, and the EU High Representative, who also signed up to this deal on behalf of the 28 member states, are very much invested in this deal working. They had a stake in bringing the deal to the negotiating phase between the US and Iran, and they have a big stake in the preserving the deal both from a political and an economic perspective, and moreover a security perspective. Now they want to make sure that not only is the deal preserved in its substance, but also that the political climate that came about after the deal is also maintained as far as possible under the new US administration. After the deal was struck in 2015, we've had some sort of a détente between the European member states and Iran. The EU is very keen to preserve that because they see it as in their interests to move away from a policy of contempt they had vis-a-vis Iran. They had its sanctions on the nuclear program to a policy more of engagement. That doesn't mean that they are looking to build very strong, effective alliances with Iran, but they're looking at a relationship where they can cooperate on areas where there's clearly a common interest and where needed to compete in areas where they diverge on that interest. Now, what is overshadowing that prospect right now is a very, very hostile rhetoric from Washington, D.C. on Iran, which is very different to the Obama administration policy.
Let's bring in Mostafa here. How important is the EU as part of that, you might say, troika of groups in terms of the nuclear deal? Iran perhaps has a more warmer relationship with the EU since those sanctions have been lifted. How important are the EU to Tehran right now, considering the Trump administration?
Well, I personally believe, and all people in here believe, that the EU is a major part of the deal, and as not just the EU, but also the Russians and the Chinese, they've endorsed the deal. So endorsing the deal means that there are some undertakings on their part as well. So they need to work on diplomacy and the various diplomatic fronts in order to convince Donald Trump and his administration to respect the deal. That's apparently what the same stance that the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese all have taken. Iran's number 2 man in the nuclear negotiating team, Mr. Araqchi, was in Russia just a few days ago, and he talked to Mr. Ryabkov, and they worked out a very good agreement, apparently, on keeping the deal and on notifying the U.S. administration of its international undertakings. Remember that the JCPOA is now seen as a major contributor to international security and stability, especially in a region that's in turmoil, and it could also provide basis for further cooperation against terrorism, as Donald Trump stated during his campaign against Hillary Clinton. He stated that he wants to share some kind of cooperation with Russia and even Assad and Iran against ISIS. He was questioning if ISIS is the number 1 enemy terrorist group of the United States, then why not cooperating, at least for a temporary time, for some short time, with Iran and Russia and Assad in order to stand against this threat? So if he wants to harm the deal, then there will be major problems with regard to regional stability, and that's not what the EU desires. No. The EU can find Iran as a very lucrative market. You know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Iran is the top market, a very lucrative market. But unfortunately, Donald Trump's hawkish policies have kept the risk ratios high for all investors, especially in the energy sector, and that's not what the Europeans like.
Okay, well,
because they can earn a lot through making investment in Iranian economy.
Let's bring in Kenneth Katzman. You're nodding in agreement, and you're also shaking your head as well. I'd just like to clarify why you're doing that.
Well, Donald Trump did not talk about partnering with Iran. He did talk about Russia. He talked about maybe tolerating Assad and said Assad is fighting terrorism. This is the distinction. Remember, you know, after the September 11 attacks, the U.S. partnered with a lot of people, but not Iran. Mr. Bush continued to define Iran as axis of evil. So Mr. Trump, the Trump administration is going back to that original stance where, yes, the U.S. has partners fighting the Sunni jihadists like al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State, but Iran is not considered one of these partners. In fact, the Trump administration considers Iran as one of the sources of terrorism. Not Sunni jihadi terrorism, obviously, but other terrorism, Hezbollah, Hamas, Bahraini opposition groups, various Shia militias in Iraq,
how
Yemen,
important,
the Houthis.
Kenneth, while Iran is perceived like this, then as Mostafa just mentioned, how important is the role of Russia? Because on one side, Russia is a staunch ally of Iran, and at the moment we are still watching an evolving relationship, if we can call it that, between Russia and the US, not quite sure how to deal with each other. If America puts too much pressure on Iran, will Russia step in?
Yeah, I don't see Russia as a staunch ally of Iran. I mean, there's cooperation to keep Assad in power, but there's divergence too. Russia, I think what the Trump administration wants to do is peel Putin off from Iran and work with Putin and with Turkey to settle the Syria situation, have safe zones so that the refugees can come back to Syria and not be in Europe and not come to the United States. But Iran is insisting that Assad himself stay. Iran refuses to talk about any compromise where Assad leaves. And so I think the Trump administration might try to peel away Mr. Putin to some sort of solution where there's a new government, Assad leaves, and maybe the Syria situation is settled without Assad. This is where Iran is opposing that type of solution.
Well, Ellie, let me bring you in here because lots of questions to get through. I mean, in terms of America tackling Iran, it already has, you might say, its hands full directly and indirectly with issues of Afghanistan, Syria and Iraq. They are indirectly related to the EU when we look at the migrant problem. So when Federica Mogherini heads to Washington, D.C., she's also got to talk about these other issues and how far the United States is willing to go, because it does impact on the EU as well and its 27 member states.
Sure. I mean, look, the Middle East, fortunately or unfortunately, is on the doorsteps of Europe. So whatever happens there is going to have direct consequences, not only from the issue of migration, refugee flows, but also blowback from terrorism and groups such as ISIS. Now, I have to agree with Kenneth here that the Iran issue within Washington debate is going to be part of a broader discussion about what happens between Washington and Moscow going forward. Now, there is this growing sense when I speak to folks in DC that they can peel off the Russians from the Iranians when it comes to the Syria theater. Now, we've actually, my center, done a lot of research on this issue because that sentiment also arose a couple of years ago in Europe. But actually, the indicators at the moment show that there is a real convergence of interests as things stand today in Syria between Russia and Iran. And that attempt to peel away has already been attempted, by the way, in the Obama administration. It hasn't quite worked for various reasons. Now, for Mr. Trump to be able to be successful at doing that or come anywhere close to it, he's going to have to offer the Russians some pretty big bargaining chips, which his own Republican Party may very much be resistant and stand against. Now, in that sense, I think we're not going to see a full developed Iran policy until that wider question about Russia and the US is somehow more developed in Washington's eyes. But this puts the Europeans in a very complicated position, because they have their positions on the Russians vis-a-vis what's happening in Ukraine. Yeah. They have undergone a very consistent policy of engaging to Iran in the last 2 years, and they'd like to keep those channels open with Iran. And also they recognize that another incidental or targeted military confrontation in the region, whether it's in Iran or elsewhere, is going to have real ripple effects for the European countries. And they want to try and diffuse any sort of military tension that may be arising between Iran and the United States at the moment.
Okay, Ellie, let me just stop you there. I want to give our viewers just a little bit more context and then come back to Mostafa in Tehran, because Iran's Revolutionary Guard is not just a military force, it's an important aspect of the country's political structure. That's why economic sanctions imposed last week hit local businesses that the US says are connected to the Revolutionary Guard. That's a lot of companies. The Revolutionary Guard controls almost every sector of the Iranian market, from university laboratories to weapons manufacturers. And together, those businesses are worth more than $15 billion. President Trump is said to be considering declaring the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organisation. Mostafa, can I come to you back in Tehran? The issue of sanctions on any one person or group is always an issue and has been for many years with Iran. Just in terms of sanctions being lifted, how has that changed normal life for Iranians? Have you seen a difference on the streets with sanctions, and would, when sanctions have been lifted, pardon me, and would Iranians like to make sure that the status quo stays the same, that they will see an improvement in their daily lives?
Well, no. As a matter of fact, the revival of economy has started in the last 1 year, but it's very slow, at a very slow pace, and I actually stated the reason why earlier in the program. Unfortunately, President Rouhani, he put most of his eggs in one basket. His main agenda was removing the sanctions through the deal in order to revive the economy through direct foreign investment. But because of the problems that we see nowadays, ever since the deal came into force, and on the implementation day, and the United States has been intimidating various groups abroad, especially in the Western countries, in Europe and in the US. They are not willing to make investments in Iran, despite the fact that the Iranian market is a very lucrative one. So his main agenda is in trouble, and that has lowered his chances, President Rouhani's chances, for a re-election in about a few months from now, when the election season starts. Now, that's why the reformist camp, as well as the moderates in Iran, are thinking of second and third options to see if, in the opinion polls in the next few months, sure, if President Rouhani cannot score a very good, rate, they would replace him. But the point is that various opinion polls done through Maryland University and Tehran University, they show a sharp decrease in President Rouhani's popularity rate. On the other side, opposite side, his critics have gained momentum, and their popularity rate is on rise.
Okay, we'll leave it there. It's a very quick one, Ellie, in terms of summing up our programme. I mean, of course, the Europeans would like to see, of course, as they did when sanctions were lifted, one European leader going after another to make an economic deal with Iran. Obviously, they'd like to try and see the status quo stay like that for the time being, for global security, if nothing else.
Look, as I said at the beginning, we have started to shift from a position of a containment policy of Iran, which was proving to be not as effective as people thought originally on both the nuclear issue and the regional issues, to an engagement policy where we're not talking about building an alliance between Iran and the Western countries, but a transactional relationship where you can do deals on areas where you agree, you can do business, you can do trade, and you disagree and you compete in areas where you diverge. And now what we're worried about, what's happening in DC, in European capitals, is now we're relapsing to the days of 2003 of axis of evil rhetoric, where Europeans effectively have to do damage control and damage limitation here instead of developing a more constructive relationship in a region that's very close to home.
Well, there for the moment we will have to leave it, but I'd like to thank all of my guests, Mostafa Khoshchesm in Tehran, Kenneth Katzman in Washington, D.C., and Ellie Geranmayeh in London. Thank you also for watching this edition of Inside Story. You can watch the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com, and for further discussion you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail Rahman, and all the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company. Bye-bye.